Kale knew his place. It was typically just beyond the periphery of direct vision, near the perpetually shadowed archway of the Volcar Citadel's Grand Library, or perhaps in the dusty alcoves reserved for ancient, forgotten texts. He was the human apprentice, a minor curiosity in a court ruled by creatures of eternal night and overwhelming magical might. His master, the ancient Lich Lord Valerius, rarely remembered Kale's name, preferring the simple descriptor, the mortal. His purpose was equally simple: fetch, carry, transcribe, and most importantly, be silent. Princess Serafina Volcar, the heir apparent to the Obsidian throne, barely registered Kale's existence at all. Her world was a sleek, dangerous cascade of black silk, dark magic, and the absolute certainty of power. Her skin was alabaster, her eyes twin embers of red light, and the huge midnight wings that often unfurled behind her were less a feature and more a statement of dominance. Whenever she swept through the halls, flanked by her elite guard, the massive, armored orc-like figures known only as the apex predators, Kale instinctively flattened himself against the cold stone, a shadow among shadows. Today, however, the princess was addressing him directly, a situation so rare it made Kale's spine prickle with apprehension. Apprentice, Serafina's voice was like velvet drawn over obsidian, smooth and cutting. You have retrieved the rune of Sarthus? Kale held out a small, lead-wrapped cube. Yes, your highness. It was in Vault 7, sealed beneath the 3-layered wards, as Master Valerius requested. Serafina did not take it. Her gaze, usually icy with indifference, was now sharp with calculation. She was standing in the cavernous Gothic entrance hall of the Citadel, a place of massive, shadowed columns and eternal twilight. Behind her, the 4 apex predators loomed like animated statues, their leader, Grolak, a hulking mass of muscle and dark steel, standing perfectly still. The air was heavy, charged not with magic, but with pure, simmering tension. The delivery is delayed, she stated, her lip curling slightly, a gesture of distaste. The courier carrying the tribute for the mountain warlords was ambushed an hour ago. We are now short 1 transport, and the rune must depart immediately. Its delivery must be witnessed by midnight, or the treaty fails, and Volcar faces a mountain siege. Kale waited, knowing this preamble was leading to something profoundly unpleasant. The apex predators cannot be spared for a menial delivery task, Serafina continued, dismissing her guards with a flick of her hand. Nor will I risk a high-ranking sorcerer on such a simple road journey. You, she paused, letting the word hang in the air like a condemnation, are expendable, quiet, and know the back roads. You will take the rune to the Gorge of Knives. It was a death sentence disguised as a task. The Gorge of Knives was known for its predatory monsters and its bandits, and the recent ambush meant the entire area was now a hunting ground. Your Highness, Kale began, his voice surprisingly steady. I only know basic enchanting wards. I have no combat training. I will not survive the journey. Serafina stepped closer, her red eyes narrowing, the faintest sound of her heavy wings shifting in the gloom. Then perhaps you will die serving your mistress, which is precisely your function, mortal. Now go. You have 2 hours. She thrust the cube into his hands. It felt impossibly heavy. Kale turned without another word and began his walk out of the Citadel, the weight of the vampire princess's contempt pressing down on him harder than the lead cube. He passed Grolak, the huge predator leader, whose eyes, for the briefest moment, seemed to hold a flicker of pity or perhaps warning. The road was worse than Kale had imagined. The forest pressed in, ancient and suffocating, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something feral and metallic. Kale had been walking for nearly an hour, heart-pounding, relying only on the faint light of the moon filtering through the canopy. He thought he had made it to the clearing, the halfway point, when the sound came. It wasn't the noise of a bandit or a simple beast. It was a guttural, wet snarl that vibrated the very dirt beneath his worn boots. 3 hulking, shadow-skinned creatures, gargantuan gnolls, each taller than 2 men and armed with razor claws, slunk out of the darkness. They were creatures of raw, untamed apex savagery, drawn by the smell of fear and the faint magic of the rune. Kale froze. He had 1 small, enchanted dagger given to him by Valerius for cutting through magically sealed ribbons, and the rune of Sarthus. Nothing else. The lead gnoll, its eyes glowing yellow with hunger, lunged. Kale did the only thing he knew. He threw the rune cube onto the ground and shouted the only combat ward he had ever memorized, a deflection spell taught to 10-year-old novices. The ward sparked, a pathetic puff of green smoke, and instantly dissolved. The gnoll didn't even slow down. It was over. Cale squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the claws. But the claws never reached him. In that instant, faced with utter, inescapable mortality, Cale didn't panic. He didn't despair. Instead, something deep inside him, something coiled and ancient, simply refused. He opened his eyes. The world had gone silent. The gnoll was frozen a foot away, mid-pounce, its face contorted in a snarl of fear. Its claws were locked inches from Cale's chest. The two gnolls behind it had stopped completely, their massive bodies rigid. Cale felt a shift, not of magic, but of pressure. It was like standing on the seabed and realizing the entire ocean was pressing down on you, yet you felt nothing. He wasn't drawing power. He was simply asserting a state of being. He reached out a shaking hand, not to cast a spell, but just to touch the gnoll's muzzle. As his fingers made contact, the creature didn't move, but its yellow eyes rolled, filled not with aggression, but with absolute primal terror. It was paralyzed by something beyond physical or magical bonds. It was paralyzed by will. Cale looked down at his own hand. It was vibrating slightly, emanating a faint, cool light, not arcane, but purely mental. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he was the center of it. He was overriding the universe's decision to let him die. He pushed his hand forward, a gentle shove. The gnoll exploded backward, not from force, but from repulsion, crashing through the undergrowth like a thrown boulder. The other two gnolls, still frozen, suddenly broke their paralysis, not to attack, but to turn with impossible speed and flee, tearing through the trees in blind, panicked haste. They were apex predators, and they had just stepped back. Cale stood alone in the moonlight, breathing hard. The silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by his own ragged breath. He walked over, retrieved the lead-rune cube, and continued toward the Gorge of Knives, his simple dark tunic now looking less like an apprentice's robe and more like a shroud for something immensely dangerous. The sun was barely rising over the mountain peaks when Cale returned to the citadel, exhausted but intact. He was ushered immediately into the princess's morning court, a high-ceilinged throne room filled with silent, judging nobles, vampires, dark elves, and powerful sorcerers. Seraphina sat on her throne, looking utterly regal and mildly annoyed. She had assumed he was dead. "You are late, Apprentice," she said, her voice betraying only a hint of surprise. The rune was delivered just at the deadline. "How did you evade the ambush?" Cale approached the center of the hall. He noticed Grolak and the apex predators were standing much closer to the throne than usual, and their massive forms were tense. "The couriers were indeed ambushed, Your Highness," Cale replied, meeting her red gaze with a flat, unwavering look. But the predators who conducted the raid were themselves hunted and scattered by 3 gargantuan gnolls. "I arrived after the chaos, and the gnolls, having gorged on the bandits, were busy with their kill." It was a half-truth. He had arrived before the gorging, and he knew why the gnolls had scattered, but he would never tell her. Seraphina leaned forward, curiosity finally overcoming her disdain. "And the gnolls permitted a lone human apprentice to simply walk through their territory?" Cale shrugged, an almost arrogant gesture that didn't go unnoticed in the silent court. "They looked at me, Your Highness." And then they stepped back. It was a simple statement, but the effect was instantaneous and profound. One of the court's sorcerers scoffed softly. "Nonsense. Gnolls fear nothing but the Lich Lord's raw power." But Grolak, the leader of the apex predators, shifted his stance. His heavy, armored foot scraped the polished stone floor, a sound like grinding mountains. Every noble in the room turned to the imposing guard. Grolak did not look at Cale, but he addressed the princess directly, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Your Highness, the gargantuan gnolls of the Black Woods are creatures of instinct. They do not fear magic, they do not fear steel. They only step back from something that defies the rules of the hunt." He paused, his eyes, dark pits of ancient war, finally turning slowly to rest on the small, unassuming human in the center of the room. "They stepped back, Princess," Grolak repeated, his voice low but ringing in the vaulted space, "because they understood instinctively that the boy has a will so hard, it is harder than stone. They realized he is not a mage. He is a flaw in the food chain. He is the ultimate apex predator." The silence that followed was absolute. Princess Seraphina, the vampire princess who saw Kale as an expendable errand boy, suddenly saw him through the eyes of her most terrifying battle-hardened warrior. Her perfect, calculated mask cracked for the first time, revealing pure, stark disbelief, mixed with a chilling, predatory interest. Her red eyes burned into Kale, finally seeing him for the anomaly he was. The morning court dissolved in a flurry of hushed, frightened whispers. The nobles, creatures whose entire lineage was built on the superiority of magical bloodlines, looked at Kale as if he were a mathematical error that refused to be solved. An apex predator who commanded fear in monsters through sheer obstinacy? It was impossible, and therefore it was a terrifying truth. Serafina did not dismiss Kale immediately. She watched him, her long, slender fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the armrest of the throne. Kale kept his stance perfectly neutral, a practice ingrained from years of trying to be unnoticeable. Now that stillness felt like a deliberate challenge. "Grolak," Serafina finally said, her voice regaining its perfect, chilling composure. "Your assessment is noted." Dismissed. Grolak, whose praise had changed Kale's life forever, only offered a low, reverent bow toward his princess. But as he turned to leave, his massive armored head tilted imperceptibly towards Kale in a gesture that was not deference, but respect, a warrior acknowledging a vastly superior threat. When the last of the nobles had swept out, the heavy wooden doors sealing the chamber, Serafina finally spoke, leaning forward, resting her chin on her hand. "An apprentice who frightens gnolls. Fascinating. And highly inefficient." "Inefficient, Your Highness?" Kale asked, maintaining his plain tone. "Magic is a resource," she explained, her voice pedagogical, as if teaching a child. "It is drawn, shaped, and expelled. It is measurable. Your ability is none of those things. It is unpredictable, therefore dangerous." She paused, her red eyes burning with analytic intensity. "I must know its ceiling, Kale. And I will not take a simple warrior's testimony as proof." "And how will you test it?" "The shifting labyrinth of Xylos," Serafina stated, her gaze daring him to flinch. "It is a nexus of raw, untamed reality, not magic. It was built by a long-dead elder god to test the mettle of minds, not spells. It feeds on fear, despair, and doubt. It traps the consciousness, allowing the physical body to walk on forever, hollowed out and insane. It was worse than the Gorge of Knives. It was a hell designed specifically for the mind. My master, Valerius, once sent 6 powerful dark elven mages to retrieve a certain relic from its core, the heart of the void. Only their bodies returned, shells with shattered minds. It is said the labyrinth's reality is absolute. Your power, if it is what Grolak claims, must be the assertion of a greater absolute." She opened a silver chest at her side and pulled out a small, jagged obsidian crystal. "This is a labyrinth key. It opens the outer passage. If you return within 3 days with the heart of the void, a volatile, pulsing crystal found at its very center, your new status in Volcar will be confirmed. If you fail, you will be just another shell in Valerius's workshop, suitable for transcription only." Serafina smiled, a flash of predatory perfection. "Go. Prove to me that mortality is not a weakness, but a weapon." The entrance to the labyrinth was hidden deep beneath the citadel's lowest dungeons, in a chamber where the raw stone seemed to weep cold water. The key felt heavy and wrong in Kale's hand, vibrating with a dissonant energy that made his teeth ache. The moment he pressed the obsidian key into the rock face, the air shimmered, and the stone dissolved into a swirling tunnel of blinding white noise. He stepped through. The other side was not a cave or a corridor. It was nothing. Kale stood on a floor of cracked infinite gray stone, under a sky that looked like old stained glass. There were no walls, no landmarks, only the oppressive weight of non-existence. The very concept of direction seemed to mock him. "You are lost," a voice whispered, thin and mocking, yet entirely internal. "You have always been lost." Kale took a deep breath. He realized the labyrinth wasn't assaulting him with fireballs or lightning. It was assaulting him with doubt. It was forcing him to accept its objective truth. He was weak, he was mortal, and he was lost. He closed his eyes and remembered the gargantuan gnoll, the snarl, the razor claws inches from his chest, and the moment he simply refused to yield. It wasn't a spell. It was an active rejection of reality. He opened his eyes. The gray stone remained, but Kale focused his entire being on one single simple concept. I am not lost. The moment the thought solidified, a refusal without hesitation, the infinite gray floor seemed to shudder. Cracks spread, and then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the environment changed. He was now standing in the grand library of the Citadel, his familiar workplace, but everything was warped. The shelves were too tall, the books impossible gibberish. Valerius, his master, was standing over a desk, his skeletal hand pointing a bone finger at Kale. "You are insignificant, mortal. Your mind is a brittle cage of short-lived thoughts. You will transcribe the next 50 millennia for me, and forget your name in the process." This was the labyrinth's trap, manifesting his lifelong fear of being reduced to nothing. Kale looked at the skeletal master, and for the first time, he did not feel fear. He felt annoyance. Valerius's words were a statement of magical fact, an objective truth in the Citadel. But Kale asserted his own subjective truth. "I decide my own purpose." He did not raise a hand or speak a word. He simply poured all of his quiet, stubborn being into the thought. The very air around Valerius's illusion seemed to warp, not from magic, but from the immense mental pressure of Kale's rejection. The illusion of Valerius did not explode or vanish. It retreated. The figure took a step back, his jaw dropping open, the skeletal face showing utter bewilderment. This is impossible," the illusion rasped. Kale walked past the phantom, his feet firm on the illusory stone. He felt an intense draining sensation, like a furnace drawing all the air from his lungs, but the path ahead was now clearing. The shelves of warped books straightened, forming a recognizable corridor, leading him deeper. The labyrinth was yielding to his will. Deeper into the shifting labyrinth, the challenges became more psychological and more primal. He faced a swirling vortex of all the court's contempt, which sought to drown him in the emotional truth that he was only an apprentice. He overcame it by simply refusing to believe in his insignificance. He faced a wall of absolute physical exhaustion, a barrier that told his body it was too tired to move another step, but Kale willed himself forward, forcing his muscles to obey his mind. He was beginning to understand. His power wasn't creation, it was negation. He didn't summon fire. He simply denied the concept of being burned. Finally, he stood in the core. It was a small chamber, surprisingly simple, with the heart of the void resting on a low pedestal. The crystal was the size of a human fist, pulsing with an intense violet energy that screamed with pain and chaos. But the final guardian stood between him and the pedestal. It was not a beast or a sorcerer. It was a pure manifestation of the labyrinth's despair, a silent black entity shaped like a mirror image of Kale, but utterly empty. It radiated a certainty that all effort was futile, that life was meaningless, and that Kale's fight was pointless. It was the labyrinth's final, absolute statement of objective reality. The shadow figure raised its hand. Kale felt his legs buckle, his breath seized. This was not a physical or magical attack. It was a pure collapse of purpose. Kale dropped to his knees, his inner will momentarily faltering as the vast cold emptiness of the labyrinth's despair washed over him. "Why are you fighting?" The entity seemed to project. "She will only send you to another death. You are just a tool." In that moment of total vulnerability, Kale did not think of Seraphina or the Citadel. He thought of his master, Valerius, and the endless years of being treated as less than dirt, less than a ghost. He thought of the constant, quiet, personal battle to simply retain his own identity in a world that saw him only as the mortal. He opened his mouth and let out a soundless roar that was purely intellectual. "I am Kale. I decide the value of my purpose." The light around his hand returned, no longer faint, but intensely focused, like a burning star hidden beneath the skin. Kale shoved his hand forward, not as an attack, but as an assertion of his own existence. The black entity of despair shrieked, a mental sound that felt like tearing silk, and recoiled. It didn't retreat, it seemed to disintegrate at the edges, as if Kale's presence was an anti-concept to its despair. Kale surged forward, his legs suddenly strong, and grabbed the heart of the void. The moment his skin touched the crystal, the entire labyrinth collapsed, not in ruins, but in a shuddering failure. Kale stumbled back through the portal, clutching the violent violet crystal. He stood in the damp, cold dungeon, the labyrinth key crumbling to dust in his other hand. He had been gone for nearly 3 days. He was not alone. Princess Seraphina stood by a scrying pool, its surface swirling with faint, shifting images. She had been observing his entire journey. Grolak stood behind her, his huge form unnaturally still, the silent audience to the trial. Kale approached the princess and placed the heart of the void on a small, dark wooden table. The crystal immediately began to pulse, emitting tiny, powerful, chaotic magic that made the air crackle. Serafina did not look at the crystal. She looked only at Kale, her face a mask of complex, unreadable emotions. "The labyrinth should have broken you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I watched it project the essence of despair, the failure of purpose, the dissolution of self. Yet you pushed past it." "I refused its reality, Your Highness," Kale replied, exhausted, but his will still thrumming beneath his skin. Serafina finally let her gaze drop to the heart of the void. She reached out, her finger hovering inches from the pulsing crystal. The chaos energy around it was so thick it should have burned her. But Kale, without thinking, asserted a simple truth. "I decide what the crystal does." The heart of the void instantly quieted, its violent pulses settling into a steady, controllable beat. Serafina looked up, her red eyes wide, her breath hitched in her throat. She understood. Kale hadn't controlled the magic. He had controlled the crystal's nature. "You are not a mage," Serafina said, a tremor of genuine fear running through her voice for the first time. "You are not a predator. You are sovereignty." She turned to Grolak, whose massive head was now bowed in absolute, unreserved respect toward Kale. "I have retrieved the artifact, Your Highness," Kale said. "My status is confirmed." Serafina swallowed, her queenly composure struggling against the tsunami of realization. She had gained a weapon of unimaginable power, but in doing so she had created a new sovereign entity within her walls, a mind that commanded reality simply because it willed it to be so. She now had to decide how to control a power that defied control. Kale's life, which had been defined by dust and anonymity, was instantly redefined by marble and suspicion. Serafina did not just confirm his status. She shattered his old existence. The damp, dark cell he had shared beneath the Grand Library was replaced by quarters on the third spire, lined with thick, velvet tapestries that absorbed sound, and featuring a window that looked out over the eternal gardens. He was assigned 2 servants, a pair of nervous dark elves who kept their eyes strictly on the floor, and most notably, a new title, the Will Wielder. The court hated it. Will Wielder sounded almost vulgar, a crude physical descriptor in a society that valued subtle, ancient power. Vampire Lord Darien, a pale, meticulously groomed noble with eyes like chips of blue ice, was the most vocal opponent. "Your Highness," Darien argued during a council gathering, his voice a silken sneer, "we command the forces of death, blood, and shadow. To give this mortal a title that suggests parity is to cheapen the lineage of Volcar. What precisely does this will of his do? It is not quantifiable. It is not magic." Serafina sat on the throne, her gaze fixed on Kale, who stood silently just to her left, a newly assigned position of honor usually reserved for a master sorcerer. Darien, the gargantuan gnolls fled him. The labyrinth of Xylos yielded to him. "You may not quantify his ability, but I can quantify the results. Success in scenarios where magic utterly fails. Kale's ability, whatever it is impervious to the known laws of this realm. And that makes him essential." Serafina's own relationship with Kale became a study in controlled tension. She no longer spoke to him with disdain, but with a cold, almost scientific interest. She would quiz him for hours, not on his duties, but on his thoughts. "When you were faced with the gnolls, what did you feel?" she asked him one evening in her private solar. "Refusal, Your Highness," Kale replied simply. "The objective reality was that I should die. My mind rejected that premise." "And the labyrinth?" "The labyrinth presented objective reality as despair and insignificance. I asserted the subjective truth. I am significant. The labyrinth's reality was overwritten." Serafina smiled, a chilling expression that showed her canines. "You are an engine of subjective defiance. An anarchist in thought. Kale. This is why you are both terrifying and useful." Kale's training was now overseen by Grolak. The huge, armored predator would meet Kale in the Citadel's vast, empty training pit. Grolak did not teach Kale to fight with swords or spells. He taught him to endure. "The steel is fragile, mortal," Grolak rumbled one day, his huge, blunt sword resting lightly on Kale's shoulder. "The magic is fickle. Your will must be your armor." You must learn to maintain your subjective reality even when your body screams for the objective one. Pain, exhaustion, death. Kale began meditating for hours, focusing on that pinpoint of refusal. He learned to separate his mind from his senses, maintaining inner calm even when Grolac struck him with blunt, agonizing force. He would feel the crushing pain, but internally he would assert, "I am not broken." And though his body would bruise, his spirit would not waver, and the mental drain of the willpower would lessen with practice. The court's suspicion reached a boiling point during the annual tribute council, a formal gathering of all the powerful noble houses. The air was thick with political maneuvering and subtle power plays. Serafina was seated at the head of the table, Kale standing dutifully beside her. The council was discussing a disputed tax levy from the Shadow Dwarf mines. Lord Darien was leading the opposition, his arguments sharp and legally sound, designed to undermine Serafina's authority. As Darien spoke, a silent, invisible shift occurred. Kale, who had been focused on the arguments, suddenly felt the atmosphere change. It was not cold, but unnaturally heavy, like standing under deep water. A subtle, high-frequency magical vibration was entering the chamber, aimed solely at Serafina's seat. It was a spell of psychic paralysis, designed to lock her throat and mind, allowing Darien to seize control of the meeting and force a vote. Serafina, though a vampire of immense power, felt the psychic net tighten, her eyes widening infinitesimally as she realized she couldn't move or speak. Magic was attacking her, and she was helpless. Before Darien could finish his sentence, Kale acted. He didn't know the counterspell. He didn't know the caster. He simply knew what was happening, and he refused it. Kale poured his entire will into the assertion. This is not happening. The psychic net instantly snapped, not with a sound, but with a blinding mental shockwave. The caster, hidden among the assembly, let out a silent, painful mental cry. But Kale wasn't done. He focused his will, not on counter-magic, but on the truth. He projected a single, undeniable subjective truth onto the caster. You are guilty. Lord Darien, who was not the caster but the one who commissioned the attack, suddenly stopped speaking. He stood rigid, his blue eyes blank, filled with a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to confess. The Shadow Dwarf levy is not the problem, Darien stated, his voice flat, devoid of his usual arrogance. I paid the ghoulish twins to cast a psychic bind on the princess. I wanted the authority to challenge the throne. I am guilty of sedition. The council chamber exploded in gasps. The ghoulish twins, two minor, unassuming sorcerers near the back, instantly dissolved into panicked, retreating shadows. Darien, free of the will's direct assertion but now facing the consequences, blinked, realization dawning. He looked at Kale with a terror far colder than any fear he reserved for Serafina. He hadn't confessed through magic or torture, but because Kale had momentarily made him believe he should. Serafina, now completely free, rose from her throne, her wings unfurling slowly, filling the chamber with terrifying shadow. She smiled, a true, wicked smile of appreciation. Sovereignty indeed, Kale, she purred. You do not counter magic. You enforce truth. The ghoulish twins are now headless. Lord Darien, you are stripped of your title and your bloodline privilege. You will spend the next century in the oubliette, meditating on the virtue of honesty. She turned to the stunned, fearful court. Kale is not merely a tool. He is the arbiter of reality within these walls. Attack him and you attack the concept of Volcar itself. Kale stood by the throne, his new power, the power to override magic and political deceit with simple, unyielding truth, cementing his position. He was no longer an apprentice. He was a pillar of the dark throne, yet he felt the invisible chain tightening. Serafina had saved him from death, but she was now using his freedom to tighten her own control. He had won a high place, but he had lost his quiet periphery. Kale's newly granted quarters were too quiet, too large, and too far from the familiar scent of ancient parchment and dust. He was now a political figure, a concept he found far more distasteful than being a simple ghost in the Grand Library. His elevated status had bought him one significant privilege: the right to ignore his old master, Lich Lord Valerius. Valerius, lost in his eternal pursuit of arcane knowledge, had not summoned Kale since the incident with the Heart of the Void. Kale had hoped to maintain that distance. That hope was short-lived. A message etched into a piece of polished human tibia arrived late that night, delivered by one of Valerius's animated surgical skeletons. The mortal is required in the central laboratory. Immediate attendance. Kale returned to the familiar cold depths of the citadel, a world of perpetual twilight and chilling silence. The laboratory was worse than the library, a cavern filled with arcane apparatus, humming phylacteries, and the detached clinical presence of death. Valerius stood at the center, a skeletal figure draped in heavy enchanted robes, his skull a mask of ancient contemplation. Apprentice Kale, Valerius's voice was dry and brittle, like old paper. He did not look up from the vial of glowing fluid he was studying. Or should I use your new, vulgar designation? The Will Wielder. Seraphina enjoys melodrama. Master Valerius, Kale replied, standing at the prescribed distance. I have been released from my duties to the library. Irrelevant. You were bound to me by magical covenant for 70 years. A trifling title change does not dissolve the contract, the Lich Lord stated, finally setting the vial down with surgical precision. However, I concede you have become a far more interesting subject than a mere scribe. Approach. Kale moved closer, feeling the familiar, uncomfortable psychic pressure of the Lich Lord's immense power. A power that dealt in universal constants, not subjective defiance. Valerius did not use magic to examine Kale. He never did. He tapped a bone finger to his own skull. I have reviewed the scrying reports from the labyrinth and the residual energy profiles from the council incident. When you negated the psychic bind, the magical energy did not rebound or dissipate. It was simply absent. It ceased to exist, not by counterforce, but by contradiction. The Lich Lord moved to a massive dark slab of stone that served as his main research bench. Seraphina believes you are a unique weapon. Grolak believes you are an ultimate predator. Both are correct in their assessment of your utility, but flawed in their conceptualization of your source. Valerius turned his empty eye sockets toward Kale. You are not magical. You are pre-magical. Kale frowned, the term unfamiliar even after years of transcribing arcane histories. Pre-magical, master? Long before the Great Confluence, when the raw ether bled into this plane and birthed what we now call magic, humanity was ascendant, Valerius explained, his voice becoming a lecturing drone. Mortal minds were not conduits for external power. They were their own nexus. They did not channel elemental forces. They dictated fundamental truths. It was the age of man, not men who used magic but men who were their own reality. He gestured with his bony hand toward a row of bubbling alchemical tubes. Magic, Kale, is a substitute. It is a cheat sheet. It is humanity's current weakness, a reliance on a complex external system to impose order. But your will, your raw, subjective defiance, that is a relic. It is the echo of pre-confluence humanity, an original blueprint. You simply refuse the consequence of reality, and reality, for a moment, shifts to accommodate the intensity of your assertion. Kale absorbed the information, feeling a strange clarity. It explained why mages couldn't see his power, only the sudden, illogical results. So, my power is humanity itself? Kale asked. It is the potential of it, yes, Valerius confirmed, tilting his head. And that is why Seraphina is ultimately terrified of you. She is a construct of the magical age. Her power relies on rules, bloodlines, and rituals. Your power relies on nothing but the self. You are a living contradiction to her entire civilization. He began polishing an ancient silver amulet, his attention drifting back to his work. She needs you to fight the mountain warlords, whose anti-will magic is designed to break the mind, making them a perfect foil to your ability. But once that threat is neutralized, Seraphina will not hesitate to study you. And Lich Lords are not the only ones capable of anatomical transcription. Kale. Be wary of control that smells of silk and incense, not formaldehyde. Valerius fixed Kale with a final chilling stare. I neither support nor condemn your actions. You are an interesting data point, and your survival extends my observation window. Now leave. You interrupt my calculations on the geometric structure of the Shadow Dwarf levy dispute. It is surprisingly complex. Kale bowed, his mind reeling from the revelation. He was not a weak mortal apprentice, but a physical anomaly, a living connection to a lost age of human supremacy. He was a creature of pure, unbending will in a world of fickle magic. As he walked back toward the sunlit political upper spires, Kale understood that he had two enemies. The external foe Seraphina wanted him to fight, and Seraphina herself. His will had saved him from a monstrous death, but now it was forcing him into a far more complex Game of Thrones. The crisis arrived like a slow-motion avalanche. The Mountain Warlords, a coalition of frost giants, stone elementals, and northern barbarians, had finally amassed their full siege force. Their objective was not the Volcar citadel itself, but the rich, magical tributaries flowing beneath it. Seraphina gathered her inner circle in the war chamber. Kale, the will wielder, stood beside her, a strange contrast to the heavily armored Grolak and the cloaked sorcerers. The warlord's army numbers in the tens of thousands, Seraphina announced, tapping a polished nail on a massive strategic map etched into stone. But the greater threat is not the numbers. It is their vanguard, led by the Shardcaller, Croak. One of the Dark Elves shuddered. The Shardcaller is a menace, Your Highness. His magic is psychic, not elemental. He doesn't burn the body, he shatters the mind. Seraphina's gaze fixed on Kale. Precisely. The Shardcaller uses a rare form of ancient Arctic sorcery. It is not designed to counter magic, but to generate absolute, crushing doubt. It floods the target's consciousness with the objective reality of their failure, their pain, and their inevitable insignificance. It is, Kale, the perfect anti-will. The silence in the room was absolute. If Kale's power was the assertion of subjective truth, Croak's power was the ultimate denial of it. It was a duel between belief and despair. Our mages are useless against him. Their concentration fractures instantly, Seraphina continued, her voice gaining a sharp, desperate edge. But your power operates outside the ether, outside magic itself. If Croak's spell is an assertion of ultimate objective reality, your refusal must be the only counter. She pointed to a narrow gorge on the map, the only viable path for the Warlords' heavy siege engines. The Warlords will push through the Griffin's Pass at dusk. We need you to neutralize Croak. If his mind magic is broken, the army will stall, and Grolak can lead the countercharge. Kale looked at the map, his mind already calculating the risk. Valerius's warning echoed in his skull. She needs you to fight the Mountain Warlords, whose anti-will magic is designed to break the mind. He bowed slightly. I will go, Your Highness. But I require a moment to prepare. Kale spent his remaining hours not in the armor chambers, but in the training pit with Grolak. Grolak, who had taught him endurance, now taught him stillness. The Shardcaller will not strike your body. Will wielder, Grolak rumbled, his voice low. He will strike the source of your will. When the world tells you that you are dirt, that your will is a lie, you must find a way to make your refusal louder than the universe. Kale meditated, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone. He pushed his mind to the edge of his power, seeking that ancient, pre-magical blueprint Valerius had described. He was not Kale the Apprentice, or Kale the Will Wielder. He was the nexus of subjectivity. He remembered the gnolls, who fled because he refused to be prey. He remembered the labyrinth, which shattered because he refused to be lost. This time, the challenge was different. Croak wouldn't just project doubt. He would project absolute, undeniable futility. When Croak asserts despair, Kale decided, settling his mind, I will assert existence. As the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks, casting the Griffin's Pass in jagged, hostile shadow, Kale stood alone. He was at the apex of a narrow, bottlenecked ravine, looking down at the immense, slow-moving tide of the Warlord's army. Frost giants, their skin the color of old ice, hauled siege weaponry. Behind them marched thousands of heavily armored barbarians. At the very front, standing tall on a massive sled pulled by chained winter beasts, was the Shardcaller Croak. He was a thin, scarred man, draped in furs and bone amulets, but his power was not in his physique. He raised his hands, and the air around him began to warp, not with heat or shadow, but with an intense, localized distortion of concept. The army paused, waiting for Croak to break the defender's will before the physical assault began. Kale saw Croak's face, and in that instant, Croak's magic struck. It hit Kale's mind like a collapsing star. It wasn't pain. It was the immediate, unanswerable conviction that Kale was nothing. Kale saw visions. His body, dead and rotting in the gorge of knives. Valerius, laughing as he dissected Kale's brain. Seraphina, sipping blood and forgetting Kale's name moments after his death. The objective reality flooded Kale's mind. He was one mortal man against a world of magic, death, and immortal power. He was a mistake, a speck of dust, and his defiance was utterly futile. Kale stumbled, clutching his head, fighting against the psychic tsunami that was tearing apart his self-worth. Every bone in his body screamed for surrender. Every memory confirmed his weakness. You are dirt. You are already dead. You have no value, Croak's psychic magic hammered into him, louder than 1,000 drums. The will wielder is a lie. Kale fell to one knee, the mental pressure nearly crushing him. He could feel the thin thread of his will snapping, piece by piece. His power, which ran on his certainty of self, was failing against the absolute certainty of his insignificance. But then he remembered Valerius's theory. You simply refuse the consequence of reality. Kale didn't try to counter the doubt. He didn't try to summon fire or shield his mind. He focused on the single core truth that separated him from the rest of the magical realm. He looked down at his hand, closed into a fist, trembling violently on the cold stone, and he poured every ounce of his remaining conscious thought into one single revolutionary assertion. I am. Therefore, I matter. It wasn't a challenge to Croak. It was a declaration to the universe. The moment Kale's subjective reality solidified, the entire magical assault, the anti-will, didn't just stop. It was negated. The overwhelming field of psychic despair vanished instantly, leaving a profound, unnatural silence. Croak, the shard caller, staggered back on his sled, his eyes wide in confusion. The army of warlords looked around, feeling the psychic barrier they had relied on suddenly disintegrate. Kale stood up, his body shaking, but his mind now radiating a cold, blinding certainty. He had broken the anti-will. But Croak was a powerful caster. He recovered quickly, raising his hands to cast the anti-will again, this time with double the force. Kale smiled, a thin, exhausted, but utterly dominant smile. He had asserted his existence. Now, he would assert their defeat. He looked at the tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, the frost giants, the barbarians, and the shard caller. He focused his will, not on them but on the concept of the battle itself. He poured his power into a single overwhelming subjective truth. You have already lost. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The entire warlord's army, from the shardcaller to the lowest barbarian, stopped moving. They did not drop dead, nor were they physically restrained. Instead, every single mind in the gorge was instantly flooded with a shared, hyper-realistic, overwhelming hallucination of absolute, catastrophic defeat. The giants saw their knees shattering. The barbarians saw their homes burned and their leaders executed. The shard-caller saw his magic collapsing around him, leaving him a frightened, weak mortal. In their subjective reality, the battle was not about to start. It had already ended, and they had lost everything. Croak screamed, a high physical sound of sheer terror, and collapsed onto his sled, his mind broken not by magic, but by the irrefutable, undeniable truth of his utter failure. The army did not flee. They stood paralyzed, weeping, paralyzed by the weight of a defeat that had never physically occurred. They were shells, their minds utterly crushed by Kale's assertion of his will. Kale lowered his hand. He was completely drained, his legs nearly giving out, but the Griffin's pass was secure. The army of warlords was neutralized, defeated by a single quiet man who refused to believe they could win. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy, rhythmic marching from the Volcar side. Grolak and the apex predators arrived, armored giants sweeping into the pass. They didn't need to fight. They were simply walking through the ruins of an enemy's shattered morale. Grolak stopped next to Kale, his eyes, dark pits of ancient war, fixed on the paralyzed enemy. They stand, but they are hollow, he rumbled, his voice filled with awe. You gave them the ultimate subjective reality. Will wielder. Defeat. Kale leaned against the stone wall, trying to regain his breath. The pass is clear, Grolak. They won't move for days. No, Grolak said, looking at the broken shardcaller. They will never move again. You did not defeat them. You erased their purpose. Kale was brought back to the citadel, exhausted but triumphant. Serafina was waiting for him, alone in the war chamber, the silence heavy with the magnitude of his victory. She did not smile. She did not offer praise. She looked at Kale, and her eyes, for the first time, were filled with pure clinical horror. You saved Volcar, Kale, she stated, her voice flat. But you did not use magic. You simply erased their will to fight. You demonstrated absolute sovereign power. She stood up and walked toward him, her shadow engulfing him. I thought you were a tool, a weapon I could aim. I was wrong. You are the echo of the pre-confluence, the ghost of humanity's true, tyrannical supremacy. You do not just serve the throne, you define it. Serafina raised her hand, and instantly, Kale felt a subtle, chilling magical net descend upon him. It was a binding ritual, ancient and powerful, designed to lock a lesser being's mind to a master's will, ensuring absolute loyalty. You are too dangerous to be free, will wielder, she whispered, her voice laced with finality. I thank you for your service, but now your will belongs to me. The atmosphere in the war chamber, heavy moments before with the scent of ozone and triumph, was suddenly replaced by the cold dread of absolute betrayal. Serafina's hand was raised, and Kale felt the binding magic, 1,000 invisible, needle-sharp barbs of pure magical covenant, descend toward his mind. This was the ultimate objective truth Serafina sought to impose. You are my tool. You are bound to my will. The binding was not rough. It was meticulous, ancient, and designed to permanently lock a lesser being's cognitive function to the commands of the vampire throne. Kale felt his mind instinctively recoil, struggling against the foreign imposition of control. Serafina watched, her red eyes gleaming with clinical satisfaction. Do not fight it, Kale, she whispered, a chilling echo of her earlier soft commands. It is the way of the world. Power commands compliance. You are magnificent, but your magnificence belongs to Volcar. Kale closed his eyes. The pain was immense, a violation of his very being. He saw flashes of his past, the endless transcription for Valerius, the disdain of the court, the constant suppression of his own desires. He had traded one form of servitude for a higher, more dangerous one. But the fear did not last. He had faced the anti-will, the crushing certainty of despair, and survived. This was just another, more complicated form of objective reality. He remembered the core truth that Lich Lord Valerius had uncovered. You are pre-magical. You simply refuse the consequence of reality. Kale poured every fiber of his being, every memory of his struggle, every lesson from Grolak, into one single devastating assertion. He did not counter the magic, for his power was not counter-magic. He rejected the very premise of the binding. He asserted the subjective truth that defied Serafina's entire civilization. I am not owned. I am free. My will is sovereign. The magical net, the binding ritual woven from the very laws of the ether, collided with Kale's absolute, unbending subjective will. The effect was not an explosion, but an instantaneous, catastrophic implosion. Magic, by its nature, is rule-bound. When Kale asserted his freedom, a concept the ritual was magically prohibited from accepting, the entire framework of the spell collapsed inward on itself. The magical energy didn't just fail, it was instantly negated from existence, consumed by the absolute contradiction. Serafina let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back from the sheer silent shockwave of conceptual collapse. The binding ritual had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of burnt sulfur and a profound echoing silence. Kale stood tall, his eyes now open, burning with a cold, righteous clarity. He was utterly drained from the confrontation with Croak and the subsequent will exertion, but he was intact and he was sovereign. Serafina recovered quickly, her face pale beneath her unnatural skin, her mind reeling from the impossible failure. Impossible, she breathed, her voice cracking. The covenant of Volcar has never been defied. You should be bound. I am a man, Kale stated, his voice quiet, yet somehow louder than the silence of the room. He held out his hand, palm up, and the heavy obsidian heart of the void, which had been resting on the table, floated silently toward him. He looked at the crystal, then back at the vampire princess. I decide what is possible, Your Highness, and I refuse the notion of servitude. He did not need to use his will to force her to concede. The objective reality of the situation had already shifted, and she saw it clearly. Serafina, the vampire princess, heir to 1,000 years of absolute rule, sat back down heavily on her throne, the shock finally giving way to a dreadful total defeat. She had tried to weaponize the ultimate freedom, and in doing so had freed the weapon itself. You saved the citadel, she finally managed, her voice hollow. And now you have destroyed the very concept of its dominion. Kale walked toward the massive arched doors of the war chamber. He stopped, looking back at the throne, at the symbol of the dark realm that had tried to consume him. You believe your power comes from the ether, from bloodlines and ancient rules, Kale said, not to gloat, but to instruct. But the ultimate reality is defined by the mind that refuses to break. Humanity is not weak, Seraphina. It is simply distracted by magic. You saw me defeat the warlords by asserting one truth. Defeat. Now you will remember this one. I am free. He turned and pushed open the massive doors, the sound reverberating through the silent citadel halls. As Kale walked through the high Gothic corridors, down past the silently watching court sorcerers and nervous dark elves, he was no longer a shadow. He was an anomaly given physical form, the walking antithesis of the magical age. He reached the main courtyard, where the last rays of the dying sun struggled to penetrate the citadel's eternal gloom. Waiting for him was Grolak and the full squadron of the apex predators, a silent, unmoving phalanx of muscle and dark steel. Kale stopped before the massive leader, prepared for a final physical battle. Grolak did not raise his sword. He did not move to block Kale's path. Instead, the enormous battle-hardened Grolak, the ancient warrior who had known only subservience to the Volcar lineage, did something he had never done for any mortal. Grolak lowered his massive armored helmet in a slow, deep bow of absolute, unreserved respect. Behind him, every single apex predator followed suit, their movement perfectly synchronized, a crashing sound of steel on stone that echoed the new order. Will Wielder, Grolak rumbled, his voice coming muffled from beneath the helmet. The path is clear. Go. Kale nodded once. He did not accept this as fealty, only as the objective truth of his newfound sovereignty. He passed through the bowing guards, crossing the threshold of the obsidian citadel and stepping out into the free air. He was no longer Kale the Apprentice, or Kale the Will Wielder. He was simply Kale, a man who refused to be bound, leaving behind a kingdom that had been irrevocably changed by the sheer force of his own singular human will. In the abandoned war chamber, Seraphina sat alone on her throne. She reached up and touched the smooth, cold stone armrest. Her reflection in the polished marble showed the beautiful, terrifying face of a vampire queen. But behind the eyes, the calculation was gone, replaced by the profound, chilling realization that she was no longer the ultimate power in her own dark realm. A single human apprentice, who was never meant to survive the first day, had simply willed her to be less, and she had no magic left to refute it.